I started working with lasers as someone who came from sound, but was always interested in the visual arts world too, and in abstract paintings and in everything which happened in the 1950s and 60s as far as kinetic art is concerned. So I always had this strong interest in the topic. And 10 years ago or something like this, I was asked to do an installation for a gallery, and something just knocked in my head and said, hey, do something with a laser. And this is how it all started. And I spare you the details of a long journey till I finally got to my first exhibition. But it happened. And what I did for this first exhibition was I made a very, very complex setup, a very complex max patch, which controlled 4 lasers in, well, a multitude of ways, with a lot of stochastic functions and a lot of algorithmic things going on, with the aim to create an installation that never repeats and is always slowly changing. The beauty for me about working with computers is the fact that they can do things by themselves, and that I can combine a few things and maybe add some randomness, and the result is far more complex than whatever I could write on paper or compose by myself. So I compose a machine, and then this machine creates the results. And I like to show a bit of this video from this installation, so you get an idea what I'm talking about. Those of you who are already working a lot with oscilloscopes, and that seems to be the majority in this room, recognizes a few things that we all do, like the quantization of movements and underlying grids and those kinds of things. And so nothing there technology-wise is very extraordinary. What makes it work for me is the way how it changes over time and the exact behavior. And this is what I find very interesting when I talk about my work. It is not about doing something that is extremely complex. It is not about doing something that is necessarily state-of-the-art, whatever that means. It is just something that has my personality in it, and where I try to be as good as possible within the technical setup I create. And what I wanted to achieve with this installation was, I'm using 4 lasers. This is quite large, actually. Here's a person standing in the shadow, and this is some 20 meters long, and I wanted to achieve something that looks like one living painting machinery, where you don't recognize that it's actually 4 lasers which are individual things. And an interesting aspect of this is that in order to test the synchronicity between those 4 lasers, I invented this moving shadow. So the moving shadow was really a technical synchronization test. I knew that once I managed that the shadow goes through from here to here, that my technical setup works. And so I made all this working, and then I added the shadow, and then I noticed that the synchronicity was not good. So I moved things till the shadow made this really nice, convincing movement. And then I was done, and I turned the shadow off. And then something interesting happened. I thought, hey, the shadow was actually cool. Because the shadow put all this in the background and added something black negative in the foreground. And then I decided the shadow has to be part of it. And then I also decided that this shadow feels like a blade of a windmill, so it has to have this sound going on. And the sound system in the gallery is 8 speakers on the ceiling, so the shadow really moves like this. And you all know this, what happens to the sound if you're standing in front of a speaker and the high frequencies are gone. So there's this high frequency science fiction laser type sound which is coming from everywhere. And when the shadow moves, where the shadow is, I'm muting this high-pitched sound, so that you really have the feeling when you are in the gallery that this shadow covers the installation and the sound. And very simple, but very powerful if you're experiencing it. And the rest is just fine-tuning of all these things that make those patterns, and change the movement of the lines, change the color, change the brightness, and all these details. And as a result, there is something that changes over time, and I never know exactly if it's gonna look good or not. There is a possibility that this whole thing folds into one single horizontal line. There's a possibility that it's all rotating very fast, and I can't predict when this happens. I show you another excerpt here in the video, if I can. Can I? Yeah, here you see the fast movement coming. Maybe. Actually, no, it was not here. Where is it? Where's the fast movement? Does not do this whole thing justice. This is really rotating very fast around, and this is something that I just discovered when I showed it in the museum, when fine-tuning it in the museum. This is nothing I did before, because it didn't look good in a small room, but it looked really nice when it was actually really going very chaotic and overwhelming in the space. So this was my journey into lasers, my first one. In retrospective, I'm pretty amazed by what I achieved there, and I could only achieve this because I was so naive. I didn't bother with a lot of things that I nowadays would bother with, and I just happened to have good luck that everything worked the way it was supposed to work. And of course, I'm more known for my, or at this time at least, I was more known for my musical stuff because I didn't do many installations. So people asked me, this is cool, when do you do concerts with lasers? And my initial response was, I don't, because it's too much effort, it's too expensive, it doesn't make sense. But then, of course, if people continue asking you such things, you think, concerts with lasers, kind of cool. And I decided to develop something that is very different from this, which had the main idea that I wanted to do simple things, and I wanted to do these simple things in a rapid succession. And I wanted to have a meaningful correlation between what I hear and what I see. And of course, the first thing you do when you work with vector graphics and lasers is you listen to the sounds that makes. And if you draw a circle, you get this sine wave, cosine wave. It sounds like a circle, you know, a sine wave and a circle makes sense sonically. You draw a square and you get a sound that is also kind of, yeah, you accept this as this is how a square sounds. For me, the problem already starts with the fact that why can a circle, one circle can sound like a low C and the other circle can sound like a high C, and they look the same. There's a contradiction there in my anal brain that was not satisfied by that. things get really problematic if you want to draw two circles. Because two circles with lasers is, of course, you draw a circle and you turn the laser off, you move to a different location, you turn the laser back on, you turn the laser off, you move back, and the resulting waveform is really complex. So if you listen to the sound of the control signals for creating two circles, you hear something quite nasty, and this doesn't relate to what you see, in my opinion. You see two circles, so you could argue that you would expect to hear two nice sine waves, instead of you hear a really complex signal. And so all these contradictions led to the fact that I thought I need to find a different way. And the first thing I did was very obvious also. I just added a different track which played a synthesizer. So I had one track which was controlling the laser and one track which was MIDI notes for synthesis. And of course this works. This is how a lot of people work. The problem is every time I want to change a visual pattern, I also have to change the sonic pattern and the other way around. And so I came up with an idea for a framework where I built technically something that allows me to treat a sound and a shape at the same time as a single audiovisual node. And this was the beginning of a quite insane journey. And I show you the third iteration of this journey now. So the structure of what I'm doing when I perform live is this is the simplified version of the simplified version for tonight's improvisation thingy. So here's a MIDI track. The MIDI track contains notes, and each note goes into a bunch of Max for Live devices, which are basically here for, the first ones are here just for modifying things so that I can perform in a nice way. This is important. This box here has 24 parameters that are visual parameters. So zoom, shape zoom, color, saturation, brightness, speed, LFO amount, LFO rate, and a lot of more things. So these are all parameters with which I can control the shapes I draw. And then comes this little beast, and this is very important. This is a synthesizer which is not very powerful. It's a mix of FM and sample based, but the important part of the synthesizer is the visual patterns I trigger, and I will show this to you in a second. They are triggered by a MIDI note and a program change. So I have 99 MIDI notes and 99 program changes, so I have a lot of potential room for creating shapes. And this synthesizer has the same amount of presets. And if I just, let's do something here from scratch. So I define, let's program change. I assume 57 is not in use. So I have this C here on a C3 on 47 and on program change 57. And this should now actually do something. Why doesn't it? Hello, MIDI note. I love it if I show things and they don't work. All right, try it again. Yeah, that was not so complicated. So you see this pattern here is doing square, circle, square, circle. And of course with all these modifier things here, not here. Hello. This is a lousy demonstration today. I'm really sorry for that. So with all these modifiers here, I can change things. For instance, make it having nice dots and those kinds of things. So this is the basic principle how I create stuff for my laser live performances. I write text, and the text is interpreted as shapes. And the next thing is that you see here on the sound synthesis, things are changing. And now I can just assign the 60 is the circle. So let's assign a sound to this. This is this one, and this is off. Okay. So I grab this one, and so this here is the one sound, and I just assign something else to it. And I take this one. And yeah, there's some strange delay going on here. Why is this? Yeah, there's an asynchronicity between the oscilloscope and the projection. So I try to solve that by delaying stuff a little bit. Okay, so that's the principle. And so let's do a bit more advanced stuff here. Why is it the case that I don't see the square anymore? Something really strange happened here. Seems to be the topic of the day. Hello. My sound card disappeared again. Can't be. Okay, it's back. So let me show you a few more complex examples to get you an idea what this thing is capable of. It's again off. Fuck it. This computer is gonna die soon, I have the feeling. Sorry, what? Yeah, so there is some text here, which looks a bit weird, but so show you a few more complex figures, which are nicely modulated. You've seen all these things a few thousand times before, and that's what I meant with I'm not doing anything here that is very special in itself. It just makes a difference if it's possible to sequence those things really, really fast. So, and yeah, this is a nice combination of things. And you have to imagine that each of those has an associated sound, and you're gonna hear this later. I'd like to talk a bit about the nerdy side of these things. Because there went quite a lot of effort into making this happen. So the reason why I came up with this text-based idea was the following. At the beginning, I built a synthesizer which is pretty much like a modular synthesizer system. Okay, I have a switch which switches between basic shapes. I have a switch that changes the colors of the laser. I have a module that modulates the intensity. So all these kind of things. And you end up with a lot of knobs. And the problem is, if I want to control these shapes and I want to create them, then I always need to store a gigantic preset. And I thought this is not very intuitive to handle. And instead of, I wanted to have something that allows me to do simple things with very simple commands. And this is why I came up with this kind of scripting language idea to say, if I want this machine to draw a line, I don't want to adjust 500 values. I just want to say line. And so this was the birth of this idea of defining shapes not as numbers of parameters, but in text. And the advantage, which I just learned later of this whole scenario, is that I can actually open up my presets and read them and copy them and correct them and analyze them and do all sorts of interesting stuff with it. So this is a small excerpt of all the presets I do for my large Lumière shows with 4 lasers. And each of those defines a shape which can be drawn by any of the 4 lasers at any time. And yeah, I can just grab these in a text editor and modify them and copy them to somewhere else if I want to have a variation of something that is already existing. And or if I find a preset which is in a different context which I really like, I copy it back in here. So this turned out to be really helpful to have. And I can really read it. So I know that this is number 222, means this is node number 22 on program change number 2, and this draws a Lissajous figure with 90 Hertz with a ratio of 1.004. Shape size is 0.6, so it's a medium-sized Lissajous figure thingy. There is some FM modulation going on in the Lissajous figure. That's the amount, that's the rate, which is 0.99817, so that's kind of slightly offset morphing. What else do we have? There's an amplitude modulation, which is quite high with the default frequency. I don't know which one this is anymore. I rotate this whole thing with an LFO, which has a triangular waveform, 140 Hertz, and where also the frequency is modulated and the amplitude is modulated, and so on. So I can create really, really complex things. And what I do is, normally I run this on 2 computers. So one computer runs the live set with the synthesis and with these things stored. And then I have 2 more computers that run as the rendering engines for the 4 lasers. And this is the really complicated part. This here is just nice. So up here is my text editor where I type in the things if I want to adjust them. This is very handy and very important. This is all sorts of geometric correction so that I can make sure all 4 lasers draw perfect shapes wherever they are. And this type of correction here allows me to place the lasers like one here, one here, one here, one here, which allows me, if I work with fog, that you see the beams and that it's not just a projection on a screen, but also something that's more 3-dimensional in a space. And all these parameters here for rotation, for pan and tilt, and clipping of the laser beam, and an offset and size, and corrections of some inherent geometric problems of the laser system, I can all do in here. And this is a correction table for the brightness of each individual laser source, which I need to make sure that white looks white even at lower intensities and all those kinds of things. So this whole stuff is really only there. So at the end of doing all that, no one notices that something has been done. It just looks awesome. This is the network communication here. And yeah, that's pretty much it. This was not so complicated to do. What was far more a challenge was what's in here. What I learned is, so this does a lot of stuff here at 96 kilohertz, which I want and need, because the blanking could be, and now my sound card turned off again. Yeah. That's kind of really not good. So what you see here is you see 3 bad max MSP oscilloscopes. The first oscilloscope, the small one on top, shows what my primitive generator does. So the thing that is at the beginning of this whole module, which creates a Lissajous figure, or a line, or a square, or a circle, or a letter from a font generator. I think that's it. So this stuff comes out there. And then the second screen is the result of this whole thing after all kinds of modifications, and including polyphony, which is not really the case, but multiple shapes drawing in a sequential manner. So what you see here is basically the theoretical output of my laser system. And this screen here shows what really goes to the scanners, including all the correction of the geometry and those kinds of things. This is again here the curves from here. And the cool part of this whole setup is that there is absolutely no memory in this, which means whenever this crashes here and I restart it, it takes all these parameters from the main thing and it initializes itself correctly, so that the only thing I need to control is one computer and the others just work, if the sound card works. This thing consists of basically of two layers. There's one layer which is quite some effort, and I'm not even sure if it's in here or there. Yeah. So let's have a look in here. Set shape parameters. Yeah. So in here is something I would make very different these days. There's an enormous amount of sub-windows in sub-windows in sub-windows. What all this madness does is it takes those text commands and splits them according to the semantics, and at the end fills an audio buffer. So the trick why this system works so nicely with fast changes is that I turn the text commands into values that at the end up in an audio buffer, which I use as memory. And once this is the case, then I end up in here, which is just one very large, well, not even very large, but large-ish code box gen thing that basically does all the drawing. And I was very happy that the code box is in gen, because what I do would be impossible to do if I would need to connect boxes. The beauty of this kind of writing is, so I can create up to 32 shapes at the same time, and each shape has up to 80 parameters, and each parameter has an envelope and an LFO. So this is a lot of stuff, and if you code this by creating a box for everything of these instances, you end up with a large patcher. And here, all my LFOs, for instance, this here is just, this is my, I don't know, 1,600 LFOs. It's just this bit of code here. And for those of you who are familiar with text-based languages, that's of course no big deal. But if you come from a Max perspective, this is kind of really cool to have. And so that's pretty much what I developed here for my laser shows. And this took me quite a while. And what took me almost the same time was documenting it so that I know how to operate it. And what else can I show? I think I showed most of it. Maybe there is more interesting detail here. I distinguish 3 different types of events. Shapes, which are defined by MIDI nodes. RTC, real-time control, is all these continuous changes that can run independently of the shapes, so that I can, for instance, add some noise to the intensity of the beam, or some noise to the position, or make dotted lines, or modulate the size, or something like this. And then I have nodes, which basically allows me to re-trigger certain aspects of a running shape with a MIDI node. So, for instance, I can have 16 circles that are moving in random fashion around the screen, and whenever a MIDI node arrives, the intensity or the size of a specific circle goes up. These are all kinds of things I invented in order to make things step by step more alive. And since I only have one laser here with me tonight, I can't show you the full beauty of this whole stuff, but I will be able to do something a bit more radical. That's also good. Where is Lumière performance? So this is a nice example. So one laser is drawing these 16 Lissajous figures, and second laser is drawing these 16 Lissajous figures, third laser is doing this, and laser number 4 is drawing these red circles moving around. And whenever a MIDI node arrives, one of those circles lights up and is getting a bit more brighter. And during this pattern, I have a very regular pulse of MIDI nodes going tak 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 tak, which just create this step sequencer-like behavior, visual behavior on top of these shapes. And there are more interesting photos here. One thing I like to mention, because I find it important when I work with lasers, is the fact that I can work in a different way with the room than what I could do with, let's say, video projections. The one thing is obviously the fact that making the beam visible can be super powerful. This is the most beautiful photo ever someone made from a Lumière performance. You see all these nice fog laser tunnel things here, but you see also these beams coming from 4 different directions behind the audience, and that was just a fantastic moment. And the fact that I can just use 4 lasers in different directions to project on the same wall, and that when the lasers are turned off, there's complete darkness, because unlike video, the black is really just nothing, is quite powerful. And this is a photo from a very early performance, actually from the very first one, where I was just still drawing a complex Lissajous figure. There's one interesting detail here. So I was a bit, well, I tend to be insecure. That seems to be a contradiction to how you perceive me now. But I often think I need to do something, or at least in the past, I often thought I need to do something because it has to be done that way. And one example is, if you want to do a big ticket show, which is expensive because, hey, it's with lasers and they cost actually, you have to be on stage, because the expectation, you know, this typical photo which you have seen millions of times, the audio-visual artist on a table on stage, seriously looking like that, computer screen, serious, and big video projection behind him. That's the classic icon of the AV artist. And you can't be not on stage as an AV artist, because if you're not on stage, you're just a VJ or whatever. So I decided for my laser show I need to be on stage too. But the problem is, you shouldn't stare at the laser beam with your remaining eye. That's the laser guy joke. So I hide here behind a piece of translucent glass. So that's a microphone stand with a piece of glass, and that's me behind it. And I mean, that shows how big the stage there was. It's kind of cool in this regard. So, and the only way how I could see the laser show was that there on this other microphone stand, there's one of those car mirrors, you know, at crossings where you can't see really. So you stare in this little curved mirror to get an idea of what's going on there, and then you drive out, and then you're dead. So this was my attempt to do that, and of course it didn't work. I didn't hear my sound right. I didn't see what I was doing, And afterwards I decided it's all nonsense and I don't care about expectations. I need to be in the back of the room. And so this was the only Lumière show ever where I was on stage. And well, I think that was it. I'll show you a video exactly. That was the idea. I know that there was an idea. So I'd like to show you a brief video of, this is in a church in Austria. And so you see here is the screen, and you see that I'm cropping the circle nicely here so that it does not go over the screen, just the normal business. But over the course of what I'm doing, I completely start ignoring the screen, and the result is quite typical for lasers. Let's have some sound, but not too loud because it's not so good. Oh, it's my fault here. This is the sound from the mirrors, actually. So this is the... And on top there's a bass drum and a hi-hat at some point. Yeah, and here you see I'm just drawing all over the place. And if you are in the audience and you're close to the laser, the room disappears. The geometry of the room is disappearing. I mean, you see one projection which is much larger than the room, but the room is folded like this. And this is pretty much the opposite of mapping. That's anti-mapping. And that's just something which is tremendous fun. Actually, the funny thing is that I have no idea anymore how I made this specific Lissajous figure, and I tried to reconstruct it, and I never managed to get back to this specific thing, and that kind of annoys me because I lost the original preset for that. And every time I see this, I think I want this back. But maybe it's 6 numbers to adjust, but I just don't find the recipe anymore. That was this. The first Lumière shows I did were based on the idea that I improvise everything. That was modeled pretty much after this idea of I do a really rough, in-your-face club type performance. And I didn't actually know what would be the right audience, what would be the right setup, because I have not done it before. And I constructed everything in such a way that I could switch presets very fast and that I could manipulate a lot of things in real time. And at the beginning, I thought the reason why my shows are not so satisfying for me myself as I wanted them is the fact that I need to rehearse more. Like, okay, I understood, I built a complex instrument and I need to manage sound, I need to manage the pattern, I need to manage the lasers, and it's a question of practice. And then I played the show 5-6 times and it didn't really get better. I had always great moments, but it was, okay, here's a 1-hour performance and there's maybe 10-15 minutes where it's really great and everything else is kind of yeah. And then I had one particular show where I was on the same bill as a known ultra high definition, large scale audiovisual artist. And I just thought my work is complete crap. It's not high definition, it's not perfect, it's just punk and it doesn't belong here anymore. And I was really, really unhappy. And afterwards I thought, what do I do? Either I completely stop working with lasers and just accept the fact that I'm too stupid for that, or I start again from scratch and make something much better. And in retrospective, I'm happy that I decided to do the second option. So I wrote this large framework which you just saw, and I decided I completely go away from improvising to I play back a score, like a very refined score. Actually, I can show this to you maybe. I save this. Saving is always good. And I open. This takes forever now. So I decided for Lumière, I want to do something that is perfect. And I just predefine everything. And what I do during the performance is I control a lot of the aspects of the sound, I control a lot of the aspects of the drawing, but like a conductor. So gestures, slower, faster, larger, smaller, less loud, more bass, less reverb, everything little, and that's fun. Maybe I should become conductor. So this looks then like this with 5 million automation curves. Yeah, you get the idea. If you think this was a shitload of work, yes. And so this creates a very convincing, complex behavior over time for the price of spending an enormous amount of time for every little change. And this is what this is how the current Lumière concert patch looks like, live set looks like, and then there's tons of layers with additional sounds for each track. So that's quite a complex project, but it works quite well. And what so this is, Lumière has 3 iterations, Lumière 2 and 1, 2, and 3. So 1 was improvised and crap, mostly, apart from a few really powerful things. 2 was very much scripted and pre-prepared. And 3 I started mainly because I had so many ideas which came up when I made 2, which I couldn't put in 2, so I decided I'd make a new version. And I made this version which was, at the beginning, very, very subtle, lots of detail, very slow, very narrative, kind of trying to tell a story with lasers. And the funny thing is, I found this really important when I decided to do. And much later, I found this complete crap. And I reverted a lot of Lumière 3 towards the pure experience of a visual sensation. So I got rid of a lot of narrative stuff and came back to, okay, let's have a square constantly growing and some random modulation of the intensity, and just enjoy the fact that this looks overwhelming, and that's it. And so after a long circle of making things more complex, I ended up simplifying again, which is a classic. And so this is pretty much how all this stuff works. Just for the geeks here, and I assume we have at least a 70% geek ratio, I see if I find the document which describes my scripting language for the text here. How could this be called? I didn't prepare this, so let's have a look for manual. Manual is always a good idea. And see how many text documents with the word manual come up. Much less than I thought. It's kind of I'm disappointed. This doesn't work like this. So okay, I want to show this. Let's see if I have good luck. Where could this be? It's not here. It's not. No, I think. Actually, I think it's just not on this computer. So that's why it doesn't show up. Too bad. I wrote a really long manual where every single text command is explained. But I want to explain it to you on a little detail here. So let's have a look at this again, and I make this really big. And so that we can nicely see that. That's so the overall idea is that the very first text string defines the basic shape, and if it looks up if it knows this word. So if there's circle or square or any of the known shapes, then it understands that this is what has to be drawn. If I write something there which the machine does not know, the machine is smart enough to understand I want to write text. So I could just write Robert here, and it knows that it has no shape Robert. So instead of giving me an error message, it creates the letters Robert. And if afterwards nothing comes, then it treats the next capitalized piece of text as a parameter. If a number comes, this is the frame rate, so the repetition rate. So if I would draw Robert 100, then it would know that it's supposed to repeat the shape 100 times per second. The frame rate is not variable. If I would do it again now, I would create something that takes into account the path length and adapts the frame rate so that whatever shape I draw, it draws it at maximum speed, but I didn't implement it there. So then, let's get rid of this because it makes no sense. Then the idea is that everything that has a capital letter is a parameter. So A mod stands for amplitude modulation, like the size modulation of the shape. And what comes afterwards is the value of the parameter. So the amplitude modulation has the value of 2. And if there's only one thing like this here, then there is no envelope. It just is always 2. If I have 2 values like this one, it assumes that 2 is the start value and the 0 is the end value, and it uses the default time, which is a kind of an arbitrary time unit of 1, which I can control with the global speed parameter. So if I want to have this twice as fast, I say 0.5. So this just creates an envelope going from 2 to 0 for this specific parameter, going from 2 to 0 in 0.5 units. So let's assume I want to have, instead of that, an LFO. So I just type LFO and 0.5, which means this parameter uses the default LFO waveform, the default LFO rate, and the default LFO start phase, and just modulates this parameter with 0.5 plus the real-time scaling of this value. If I want to have a different waveform, like a square wave, that's wave number 4. If I want to have this not starting at a definite start point, but at a random start, I type in -1, which sets the phase to random. And on top of it, I can have an envelope for this parameter and so on. So that's the basic construction of every single parameter. A thing which is called fish, because it's long. It doesn't matter why it's called fish. Parameters are sometimes strange because it once made a fish shape, which is a modulation with another external oscillator which runs in sync with the shape speed but with an offset. So what this does is that makes mainly sense for brightness, color, etc. So I can have a modulation of, let's say, brightness, which is slightly offset to the drawing speed, so I get these moving shapes within the shape, like this moving intensities and stuff like this. And this can also have tons of arguments, and so on and so on. One thing I didn't explain yet is this kind of polyphony. How do I draw more than one shape with that? So let's go back to circle. Here's my default circle, and I want to draw 2 circles with an, actually I can with a different, like 2 circles next to each other. So I define a position offset in the x-axis, and the parameter is called p offset x, and I set this to 0, which means no offset, so that's quite boring. But then comes a fancy argument, which again, for stupid historical reason, it should be poly or whatever, it's called meta. Meta 2 says I want to have 2 instances, and 2.1 says I want to have these 2 instances with a difference of the parameter of 0.1. So I have an offset 0, and the second one has an offset of 0.1. Let's just see if this actually works. Make the size a bit smaller. So I copy this into an empty preset slot here, and I try to restart the sound card. Oh, which is off, yeah, of course. And whilst this is doing it, I go back to the text document. If this meta thingy has a negative argument, it understands that it should randomize this. So just as the -1 for the LFO phase randomizes the LFO phase, a -0.1, well, this one here, creates 2 circles with random offset. And I can do this for every single parameter. So I kind of have this variable polyphony. I can have something that has 2 polyphony, so it folds over if I have something with 4 polyphony. I think it's getting too complex, but you get the idea. With this kind of scenarios, I can create things where I have 32 shapes moving in different ways, like a star field exploding or stuff like that. But let me try if I can. Oh, hello Max, goodbye. Good question. Yeah, we can try that. So I'm not sure. Motu. Let's see if it finds the Motu. That would be a first nice step. Ah, good. So step 1. Step 2, connect the thing. Good. Step 3, turn it on. Step 4, trying to get this whole thing in this window and update it. Okay, that looks good too. Let's turn the thing on here. and draw a circle. Aha, hey, we draw a circle, awesome. Here's a circle. So, size 0.1, ta-ta, small circle. Position offset x 0, meta 3.1. That's very impressive. What do I do wrong here? Jesus. Why is nothing working today the way I expected? 3.3. Ah, okay, well. So you see I draw 3 circles with the distance 0.3, and if I have it with -3, then we get no minus because it didn't accept it. Okay. So every time I recall this, I get this random variation here. And this should maybe do also. No, it doesn't. So I added this movement here, and I take a random parameter in here too, meta 3 minus 0.3. Well, and you see how quickly this can get turned into something a little bit more complexity. The last thing I added, which unfortunately is not very elegant, is a way to at any time modify an existing individual shape of a larger number of shapes. The problem is this reached a complexity where I would rather completely start from scratch and rewrite it, because adding more features became more really difficult. But instead of, I decided that it's just how it is, and I work with it, and I work on what I do with it conceptually and not in terms of making it more refined. And I had a moment in the past where I thought that this laser generator will become the main engine that drives all my installations, but this didn't happen. What happened instead is that when I do an installation, I rewrite again my engine just for this specific purpose. Because at the end of the day, I'm faster doing this. And each time I do it again, I learn something new than trying to adapt this large monster to do only a fraction of what it can do in a very specific way. So you could argue that, but this is how I'm operating here. I think that's pretty much everything I have to say about my work here. I'm pretty sure I forgot tons of things. There is one completely different laser work I like to mention, because it's one of those amazing happy accidents, which is this one here. So I told you about the plexiglass plate to protect me from the laser. And for a very long time, when I was working on my laser stuff, I didn't have atelier space. So I did it in my living room. It sounds strange in retrospective, but I did. And it's not very big. So here is me with my laptop, and there's this powerful laser. And here is my wall where I project. And at some point I thought maybe it's a good idea to protect myself. So I was looking around if there's something I can put somewhere to make sure that the laser beam doesn't accidentally hit right into my eye. And I found this black piece of plastic plexiglass stuff. And I put it on a microphone stand. So here is me, here's the microphone stand, here's the laser. I can't see the laser, laser can't see me. Okay, good. Then I went to have a coffee and I thought, powerful laser, black piece of plastic. Maybe I should try what happens if I actually do this. And so I turned the laser on full power and pointed the beam to the black piece of plexiglass. And it took 2 seconds, and then there was a hole in the plexiglass. And it smelled strange. So I thought, maybe it's not the best idea. But something else happened. I looked at the opposite wall whilst I was burning the hole. Here's a photo of the hole. So laser beams can actually have power. But on the opposite wall, this kind of things happened. Because what happens is that the laser beam is melting the plexiglass, so it changes the surface. You see here, all these ripples here are the result of the melting. So I turned this problem into a feature, and I made an installation where this is a 1 square meter piece of black plexiglass, and this is 2 circles from a very powerful laser, like 30 watts, which slowly scan in random movements over this plate, and each time they scan, they melt the surface a little bit. So over the course of the exhibition, it becomes more and more fractured and disturbed, and as a result, you get more and more complex reflection patterns. So this is the patterns. If laser beam is here, plexiglass plate is here, these patterns is what would happen here on this wall. And yeah, I find this remarkable because this creates such an enormous amount of complexity with zero effort in coding. And the only thing is it's not very predictable. But it's pretty impressive what comes out here. And again, accidents. This happened on the very first time I tested it. And I just had the camera there, and I just got this fantastic moment. I never got a situation which was nearly as beautiful as this one. So I almost feel guilty when I put this in a catalog, because people in the museum will never see it like this. This just was happening at this one specific moment. So what you see here is that this bubble is really exploding in this kind of speed, because the laser heats up a small portion in the middle, and this is really expanding like that. And you see this like under a microscope. And yeah, I mentioned this because A, it's a happy accident, and B, it's something that has very little to do with a lot of coding, but just with taking a good idea which happened to happen and make something out of it. And yeah, I think now I really have said everything I can say. I could talk a lot about my first early experiences. I could talk a lot about the specific laser system I use, but I guess maybe there's questions, and if not, then I'm happy to drink. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That's incredibly generous view into the system there. I think Cliff has a question.
Yeah.
Hello. I just wanted to ask you about visualizer parts, which in Jitter, which
yeah, the shitty one.
Yeah, because I was struggling with the same problem, so I guess you you didn't find a way to make it better.
Writing a C++ external.
Yeah. Okay.
Which I don't want to. So. Yeah, as you can see, I mean, this is the real thing, and this is the. Exactly. I have no idea. I learned to accept that.
I think Hansi knows a little bit more about that. What should no? I think oversampling was the word that was.
I mean, there are certainly things you could do. Ah, here's a nice one. Ah. You should see this on the oscilloscope. The camera doesn't do justice. This is extremely satisfying on the oscilloscope. Sorry.
Ooh, here we go. Run that.
I think everyone should have an oscilloscope at home, and
actually, that comes up a bit when I do my performances with the Vectracks, is that people, as they do, will come up at the end and go, hey, wow, what is that? What does that do? And then they realize what I've been seeing on the Vectrex looks radically different than what the camera captures, and then they're really hypnotized by the Vectrex. There's so much of this layer of filtering which goes on when you film a screen and then run it through a projector that just doesn't happen when you use the laser, because the laser is so immediate and direct, and there's, say, a lot less translation phases going on in there. I got to see him doing this upstairs on the wall, and I can promise you that it does incredible things to your eyeballs when you see this.
Yeah, well,
and to your brain, because your brain wants to see those diamonds there.
I think you will see this somehow during the performance. Maybe one last word about the performance. So I never did this type of performance with a single laser, and never with that specific RGB laser. So everything you will experience later is extremely improvised, and some of this might work out very well. Some of it might be very boring, and it might crash, as we already experienced. But I thought I'd rather be adventurous and risky and try to show you things on the risk that it fails than doing something that is kind of, works somehow but is boring. This is something which took me long to learn, that as a performer it's far more important to provide an experience than to provide a perfect show. Because the perfect show you can see on YouTube, and you can buy on Spotify. That's not what's interesting if I watch an artist. If I see an artist, I want to get an idea of what is this person doing, how is this person interacting with the machines or the audience or both, or the space. I'm not interested in having a perfect reproduction of the last album. And it took me very long for myself to understand that. And in this regards, I'm very happy to be at a situation like this here, where I feel the situation is very encouraging to go to your limits and say, okay, let's try something. Let's try something in front of the audience, because if it's awesome, then it will be a remarkable moment in your life. And if it's not so awesome, it's not a big deal. So what can you lose? Not much. What can you gain? Very much. So that's how I try to approach this tonight, and we will see how well this works. The tragedy is, when I started preparing this morning, I noticed that if I had 2 weeks, I could do it really, really cool. But this is always the case. Whenever you do something with a deadline, you notice that if you had much more time, you make it much better. But if you have much more time, you do something else. So, absolutely, yeah. And then you think again, if I should have started 2 weeks earlier. But this never happens. So
sounds like my taxes.
Taxes? Is this the stuff which urgently needs to be done in the corner?
Never. There's some questions in the audience, so I'm going to pass the mic around.
So I'm looking at the two parts as like you have reality and an alternate reality with a waveform, and then an alternate sound that goes along with it. Do you work at all with combining the reality and the alternate reality? At one point I saw, when you were showing, there was a big Lisa Zhu figure in the room spreading out onto the wall that was phasing, and it also sounded like it was phasing. And I could have been hallucinating from looking at too many phasing circles in my life, but it sounded like it was there. And then also, when I saw one circle separate into three, I'm expecting to hear harmonics. I'm just wondering about that.
Well, the synthesizer I made in my Max for Life thingy here, where is it, was pretty much modeled in such a way that it is in many regards very close to what the scanner does. Mm-hmm. So the code in there, the code in there is in many ways similar to the laser drawing code, minus the scenarios which I found problematic.
The particular scenario.
Yeah.
Right.
So, for instance, let's let's see if this works here. I'm
I
not
think
sure.
you just answered my question, yeah, but I'd like to see it too.
Well, basically, just as an example, I can change the scanning speed because sometimes this is really important to do as a performative element. And here's the pitch of the oscillators, and this is hard synced to this real-time control of the scanning speed.
Yeah.
So when I change the scanning speed, the pitch follows immediately. The LFOs are, if I type 3 Hertz in here and I type 3 Hertz in here, they are extremely stable in sync, which means they also respond to the global frequency change. So if I have a sound which does visual wobble and sonic wobble, and I change from wop, wop to wop, 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 the sound and the shape stay in sync. That was actually a bit of effort to make.
Yeah. So you have the choice. You with those tricky scenarios, you have the choice whether you would like to hear them or not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Including the fact that I sometimes just decide that a specific visual shape, when it appears, doesn't need to have a sound at all. So I just turn the oscillator off, and then the sound, the visual thing is there, but there is no equivalent sonically. Or there is also a lot of textural sounds that have nothing to do with the lasers, but just feel nice. And perhaps if I have time, either during the performance or before, I will add a layer of textual sounds so that I can have a nice background. I'm totally non-dogmatic here. I try to do something that is convincing, and whatever works, works. And then on a very later instance comes the kitsch police, and and the kitsch police then knocks at the door at 3 in the morning, says, "Hey, remove that." But it's so nice. Yes, remove it. And then, of course, then the kitsch angels come back. The kitsch angels said, "You had this nice chorusy reverb sound there. It should be there." And those fight in my head. And depending on the mood, it gets rough or nice or both. This is really oscillating all the time. I remove nice sounds, I add nice sounds, I remove. It's never stopping.
Great. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Hello, I want to know something about the phosphor installation.
Ah, phosphor. Okay, the inherent problem with lasers is that they're slow, and you can't do very high complex things. And I always wanted to experiment with lasers and phosphorescent paint. So the thing with phosphorescent paint is you take a blue laser beam and you shine over it, and there's an afterglow for half an hour, and like this green phosphorescent paint stuff. And yeah, I was supposed to do an installation, and I was asked to do one, which is always nice. And I thought this is a good starting point to explore this idea. And I decided that the nicest thing I could do is just having phosphorescent pigment on the floor, like here, just spray the color paint pigments on the floor, mount the laser on the ceiling, and draw something. And of course, the first thing you think to draw is, I draw the stuff I always do, like squares and geometric shapes. And if you do this with a medium which has persistence, you end up at something that is very close to the classical plotter drawings. And then I thought, yeah, that might look too much like a Johnny Le Mercier. No, I don't do this. And I came up with a different idea, and this different idea was I want to model something that is more organic. A lot of the things I do are this kind of strange mix between technical and organic. And I came up with an idea to model a structure that is close to a river of light. So let me quickly show you my fancy video. And this has no sound. And that's an interesting detail. This had a sound. I was working on it, and I wanted to have a sound that has some connection to this whole thing. And well, I just let it run for a second, and then I stop it, and then I talk. Yeah, that's a good stop point. So I had the feeling it has to have a sound, because also it's in a museum, in a group exhibition with other people, and even if it's in a separate room, you know, you have other works of other people, and they all have sound, and you want to protect yourself a little bit from the other sound. So having your own sound is a kind of like, as much as it's a kind of a way of social distinction, you know, if you're with your boombox and you play your hip hop. So I'm not this guy, but I'm the installation guy with the soundscape. So when you enter my room, you're in my soundscape. And I tried 3 or 4 different ideas for the sound. And none of these ideas were convincing. They were all, of course, connected to when I create a new dot, I create a new node, I add a topology of harmonics below that, and I trace these harmonics. I do something that is like transformed raindrops. What can I try next? I do just some nice chord progressions, doesn't need to be synced. Nah, it's not nice. Maybe sine wave oscillators, very radical, very strict. Change the volume as a function of decay time. Nah. So I tried all these things, made my checkboxes and made my notes, and nothing really worked. So at the end, I ended up having some boring, nice-sounding ambient thing. And it was a group exhibition. And an artist whose works I really like, but never met as a person, just came in my room and looked at this and commented on it in a way that, hey, this is really cool. And I really like it, but it doesn't need sound. And you just said, like, he's one of those people who's really bold. He said, the sound must go. the sound is just not working. It's not necessary. It's a distraction. Turn it off. And then I looked at him, and of course, you know, I had this feeling, shit, he's right. And then I went to the amp and turned it off. And then I came back, and we were both standing like that. And do you miss the sound? No. So that's how I ended up with my first installation with no sound. And for me, this was a brave move, because, you know, I had no idea about the sound. I had no concept for the sound. So why sound? Then make it silent. So what happens is there is a virtual 3D kind of random landscape. So just one of those low-pass filtered noise landscapes. And this is a little bit tilted in one direction. And I randomly place a start point, and then I look basically for a trajectory downwards. So where is a possible path downwards? And then with a little bit of random variation, I just find my way downwards. And this creates this kind of river run things. And it leads to these nice situations that there is pathways which are have a strong, well, like narrow canyons. And everything comes up there. And so I get this nice river-like shapes which disappear over half an hour. So you see this is old, and this is current, and this is old. And sometimes I play God or disaster. That's in this areas here, where I just make the random fluctuation of the position very high. And it creates this beautiful massive rain scenarios. And yeah, that's pretty much it. It's generative, it works forever. And yeah, well, you could do this with a blue laser, with just normal blue. The only problem is the normal blue is blue, and the phosphor pigment that you can get that has this really long glowing properties is green. And quite frankly, the green and the blue together look shitty. If you use a UV laser, then at the point of of contact, you get some more white glow and the green, and this is just nicer. The tricky part is, first of all, UV diodes are really expensive, and the scanner mirrors are not very effective for UV, so you lose a lot of energy. So there's all kinds of things you have to consider when you try to build an UV laser. If you use this 405 nanometer diodes that are in the Blu-ray DVD players, this kind of near ultraviolet, that seems to be a good compromise. But they don't seem to last very long if you modulate them very hard, which I do here. So the tricky part of this installation was really building a laser that works. And I would love to use a 350 nanometer UV diode, which is really at the peak of the sensitivity of the UV pigment. But there you talk about 3,000–4,000 euros just for the diode. So that's a bit too much. But you can do it with just blue laser and it's fine. So that's it. Maybe you can watch it a little bit longer.
Are there other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, just a lame safety question in terms of exhibiting lasers. Have you run into issues with, I mean here, how close can people get, or also when it was on the wall, how close can the audience get to these interactions?
This is a really difficult question, so I sit down. I think there's two aspects to this. The one aspect is the national laser safety laws, which are very, very different in different countries, sometimes really unexpected. So it's not that every country where you would assume that they have strict laws are strict, and vice versa. And some laws really make sense, other laws don't make any sense. And on top of that, it always depends. So if you take the laws aside, the big risk with lasers is if the beam stands still, all the energy which the laser beam has is concentrated on one single point, and this is a lot of energy. I mean, if you think about, if you draw a circle with 10 meters diameter, which is super easy to do with a laser, that means that is 62 meters in length. If you think that laser beam has half a centimeter of diameter, which is a lot, but let's just assume this, this means 62 meters in diameter, half a centimeter, 120. So every single point of the circle has only 120th of the total energy of the laser. If the laser beam is further away and the size is larger, then the energy that would hit your nerve in the eye is even less. So in a normal scenario where you draw multiple shapes and you have blanking and all these things are moving, the energy which reaches your eyes are not dangerous. If they were dangerous, then no professional working in the show laser industry would see anything, because we all have been looking into laser beams thousands of times. So this is the one thing. But if the beam stands still, then you have all this energy focused on one point. And this is just like looking in the sun through a magnifying glass, which I cannot recommend. So practically, I would say, as long as your laser beam is moving and you don't draw with insane intensity, there is not much of a risk for the audience. This is the one side. The other side is that laser safety laws, they come from a philosophy of exposure at work. So just like exposure to other types of radiation, exposure to chemicals, and the idea is it shouldn't cause harm if you're exposed to it non-stop. So the point is how little energy can the laser beam have. So it's not a problem if you work with it every day non-stop and you have constantly exposure to it. And this is why this value is so low, because yeah, if you have something that goes constantly in your eye, you definitely want it to have low energy, and this is why the energy is comparable to what a bike light has. So that's nothing where you can really have fun working with. And that means if you have a show where you project on a screen and the audience is not exposed to the direct laser beams, this works quite well in almost all countries. The usual rule you have for these kind of things is at any position of the audience, you should be, the lowest possible beam should be 2.70 meters above ground. The thinking of this is that even if you have like a mirror in your hand and desperately try to blind yourself with the laser beam, you still can't hit it, you know. So for a seated audience, if you go to 2.50 meters is also fine. And I would say this regulation makes sense as a normal safety measure. If you don't know what your laser system does, and you just make sure, for instance, with mechanical blinds, that nothing can happen below 2.50 meters at any audience perspective position, you are completely fine. The second laser risk is not about destroying people's eyesight, but it's a fire hazard. And this has, there is cases in the past where laser shows set theaters in flames and stuff like this. Because, well, if you have a powerful laser beam and it hits a black curtain for half an hour because someone is just not doing their job, you know, the curtain starts burning. And that's why you have to have safety switches that switch the laser off when the beam stands still. And you have the big red button that needs to be close to the operator. So whenever something really shitty happens, you can turn the thing off very quickly. So that's pretty much exactly. The blinking reflex most of the time works really well. I mean, over the years I became much less concerned with that when I work with lasers by myself, because you develop a feeling when things are too much. And I saw commercial laser shows. I remember I was in a club in Amsterdam. There was a laser show there, and this was a show where I was standing next to a person who is also working with lasers, Edwin van der Heide. Some of you might know his laser works. And he's also not a person who is casual. His stuff is always really in your face. And he just stand next to me and said, "This is too bright." And with covering his eyes like that. And this was on a level where I would say nowadays I would go to the laser operator and I would not talk to him. I would just press red button and would say, "Sorry, I don't know who sent you, but what you're doing is wrong." But this is rarely the case. So most of the time, I think if you're working with lasers and you follow normal standards of consideration, you are fine. There's also a rule that the laser should not point at reflective surfaces, but unless the reflective surface is a perfect mirror, it also diffuses the beam in many ways, so there's no risk. When I did this melting thing, I was actually measuring the exposure, because there with the melting thing you cannot predict where the laser beam is going, so it's likely that the laser beam of the reflective surface hits the audience. And so we measured the reflection and we noticed that 97% of the energy is turned into heat and only 3% comes back. And so there we had, this was a critical thing, because for those kinds of things there's no laws, right? Because no one there's nothing which describes the intensity which is allowed for melting plexiglass with lasers. They were big, 25 watt. Yeah, because I wanted to melt that stuff. So And that's why we were a bit careful. But when we measured what came back, we were just like, yeah, no big deal. So.
Great. I think we're going to have to call time on this. Of course, there's lots of time more informally to continue the discussion. Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Robert Henke.